Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to you all, and warm welcome to Eden as well. Eden is a senior lecturer at Essex Law School. Eden, his research centers around creative subcultures and those, especially those that deviate from the traditional intellectual property subject matter. And he is going to look at the drag subculture and its interaction with intellectual property. His other research area is also private law and intellectual property because he teaches land law like me. That was our common interest, and that's how we met in one of the conferences earlier this year. We got talking, and that's how I decided that it would be really good to hear him speak about his research. So he brings in a lot of private law in his analysis. So over to you, Eden. Very warm welcome again.
Thank you so much, Purna, for inviting me, and thank you everyone for coming here. It's such a pleasure to be here. Like Purna said, my name is Eden. I'm from Essex Law School, and today I'll be discussing my research project entitled Queens of Creativity, Drag, Social Norms, and Cultural Production Beyond Intellectual Property. Now, this project is an empirical study that explores the dynamics of creative production in the absence of IP law by focusing on a particular example, the Israeli drag queen subculture. And I examine how Israeli drag queen performers govern creative production, information exchange, entitlements, behaviors, and how they interact with IP law. And I study this at two significant points in time. First, from the early 1990s until the early 2010s, when drag in Israel was a small outlaw counterculture with very limited financial prospects. And then at a second point, from the mid-2010s onwards, after drag transformed into a cultural mainstream industry worth millions. And the main questions that I ask is, first, how have drag queens governed their creativity over time? Second, have major economic and cultural shifts that the drag subculture experienced impact the governance of creative production and drag's relationship with IP law? And importantly, what can this teach us about some of the fundamental assumptions that inform IP law and IP theory? My key findings are, first, drag queens rely on a social norm system to govern creative production, entitlements, conduct, relationships, rather than using IP law. Second, despite these major cultural and economic shifts, the social norm system has not changed, though some of the norms themselves have evolved to reflect the new cultural economic reality. Third, there are certain factors that can help us in explaining why drag queens have been successful in maintaining this creative production without IP. These include close-knit ties, effective information networks, and a shared ethos. And the important implications of this study rests in a few contributions. First, through documenting social governance in a transforming subculture, it provides an original explanation as to how norms rise and evolve in creative communities. Second, it counters some of the common conventions in IP about the regulatory, the economic, the cultural conditions under which creative production succeeds or fails, demonstrating some of IP law's, I would say, limitations in incentivizing creativity. And it also adds a new dimension to the literature on creativity without IP law that Purna was saying that I researched earlier, these negative spaces literature, because it particularly looks at a particular community in 2 points in time when it was a small counterculture and after it transformed, which helps us and it teaches us a lot about what happens to these kind of creative communities when they transform. And it also counters what theorists predict will happen. Because usually theorists tell us if you're a small counterculture that's losing money and you're not a mainstream culture that's lucrative, then fine, enjoy your social norms, IP law is irrelevant. But once you will transform, of course, law will kick in. And spoiler alert, this really hasn't happened. So it's an interesting kind of reflective on these kind of theoretical underpinnings that really underpin American and also other jurisdictions when it comes to IP law. And I think that finally, by exploring a queer subculture, it also helps us in shedding new light on the relationship between IP law and marginalized voices, marginalized communities, marginalized spaces, and particularly queer creativity. So let's dive right in. What's a drag queen? I'm sure all of you have been to multiple drag shows, but for those who haven't, drag queens are performing artists who are often, but not always, biological males that assume this flamboyant female personality and appearance to entertain an audience. What do they create? Well, they create a lot. Drag queens create names, they create personas, they have makeup, costumes, looks, slogans, brands, props, shows. They lip sync to perform to famous songs and do comedy and performance skits in front of crowds. There's an astounding volume of creativity that's happening on and a substantial investment both in terms of time and money. A little bit of context, a brief introduction into Israeli drag, just to give you some kind of idea of where it's all coming from. So Israeli drag originated in the early 1990s with the first performer, and slowly it grew in the 90s and the early 2000s. But it was still a counterculture. It was an outlaw culture. There were a few venues, 1 or 2 in Jerusalem, 2 or 3 in Tel Aviv, and that's it in those years. Actually, one of the things I found in my research was really cool. There were 2 drag queens who were fighting over the title of Israel's first drag queen. WhatsApp groups were exploding. Facebook was going crazy. Then someone found a little, someone took a picture from a certain date, and that kind of helped settle the idea of who is Israel's first drag queen. In the 1990s, her name is Divadi. She still performs. So that was then 1990s, early 2000s. Then something really interesting happens. Around the mid-2010s, drag experienced a rapid and unprecedented shift from this small counterculture with limited resources into a huge mainstream. It's a global phenomenon now. It generates millions of pounds globally. Later today at 8 p.m., BBC 3, you can see RuPaul's Drag Race. If it's on BBC, you know it's mainstreamed. And also in terms of Israeli drag, it has become a huge revenue stream for performers. So a word about my methodology to know how I collected this data. My project is based on 2 major qualitative empirical studies I conducted of Israeli drag community, which included in-depth, open-ended interviews with Israeli drag performers. The first study I conducted in 2014, when drag was still a small counterculture. Fast forward almost 10 years later, in 2022, I did a follow-up study after drag shifted into this kind of main popular mainstream culture and very lucrative industry. For the 2014 study, I interviewed 11 out of an estimated 25 performers at the time, which accounts for approximately 40% of the total drag performers in Israel in 2014. Last year in 2022, I interviewed 21 out of now 80 total drag queens, again, accounting for approximately 25% of the total performers. And of those 21 performers that I interviewed last year, 6 were repeat interviewees. So I interviewed them once in 2014 and interviewed them again in 2022 to kind of give me an interesting narrative of how things develop through their eyes. So I take the data, the narratives, the stories that they tell me, and I analyze and contextualize these empirical findings using IP literature on self-governing creative subcultures, negative spaces, law and social norms theories, theories of regulation, incentives, and cooperation. And I also account for Israel's drag historical and cultural background, and building on some of my own research on queer analysis of intellectual property. I also employ social-legal and queer theory to examine drag's unique characteristics, to provide additional context. And I think these significant numbers of interviewees from the total pool, alongside this contextualization, allows my findings to be generalizable, but still sensitive to their particular context. So talking about findings, what have I found? What have I discovered? And I think perhaps the most important finding is that both when drag was a small counterculture and after it transformed into this mainstream industry, drag queens govern creative production based on a social norm system rather than using IP law. Though the norms themselves, as have mentioned earlier, have somewhat evolved. Now, this is an important point because it, A, counters this common convention that assumes that IP is essential to incentivize creative production, and B, because it also challenges the common perception that once a counterculture mainstreams and becomes lucrative, it will abandon social governance. So what were the norms in these 2 different points in time? What were the norms pre-transformation in the 90s and early 2000s? The first were drag queens really followed what they call the Gentle Ladies Agreement, a drag code, which included exclusivity norms. So a drag queen had exclusivity. She had, if you like, ownership in her name, in the persona that she built around that name, but she could also have ownership in particular songs and particular performers. So let's take an example. We have a drag queen. Her name is Tequila Mockingbird. She has IP rights, if you like, or she has entitlements in the name Tequila Mockingbird, in the personality of Tequila Mockingbird, but she also owns, for example, all of Dua Lipa's songs, performances, skits, whatever, present and future. And any other queen that wants to use Dua Lipa's materials needs to get permission from Tequila Mockingbird. So exclusivity was really expansive and included many different elements. However, there were also strong public domain norms. So certain gay anthems and certain divas such as Cher and Madonna belonged in the public domain. No one could take ownership of them, not even Tequila Mockingbird, and those were enjoyed by everyone. And finally, there were also norms of attribution. So if another performer, another queen, legitimately used someone else's materials, for example, a drag queen called Anita Drink goes to Tequila Mockingbird, says, hey, could I use Dua Lipa's song? Tequila Mockingbird says, sure, no problem. It was expected that Anita Drink will give Tequila Mockingbird attribution, not Dua Lipa, Tequila Mockingbird, attribution for using Tequila's material. So this was way back when in the 1990s and early 2000s. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the community transformed, the social norm system remains, but some of the norms have evolved and changed. So what I see in the norms post-transformation is that we still have exclusivity norms, but fewer. So when it used to be that we had names and personas and songs and singers, now it is more restrictive. There are still exclusivity norms in the name. There are exclusivity norms in the persona, in the brand, but there are no exclusivity norms, for example, in songs and singers. However, there are new non-competition and minimum fees norms. So now it's the case that if someone is asked to perform, say a local municipality or a library asks a drag queen to come and perform, say a drag story hour or a show, it is expected that other queens will not compete with her. Also, it is expected that she will charge a minimum fee. It used to be the case that anyone could charge what they like. Now it is expected that they don't charge under a certain amount of money. And finally, while all my interviewees were very, very strongly emphasizing the fact that there's no IP or any other legal mechanism that governs their internal affairs, there is a growing shadow of the law. Meaning that with external players, such as local municipalities or producers that do want to engage with drag queens, there is more and more use of formalized law for these externals. And again, they very, very strongly emphasize that internally, there's no use of IP law. So I was looking at these findings and I was asking myself, okay, how are they so successful in maintaining their social governance system and keeping things within the community, and the fact that we see very little copying, almost none at all, and this very good kind of dynamic between the different players within the group. And I found a few things that may help in explaining why this is. The first is that there's a clear norms system. Everybody knows that there's a norm system, this gentle ladies agreement. Everybody knows that they should abide by it, that there will be consequences if they don't. And everybody knows what the do's and don'ts are, who owns what, who has entitlement to where, what they can and cannot do. It's very, very clear. All my interviews were very, very familiar with this norm system. Alongside this, there's a shared ethos. All the interviewees share this kind of belief in what Israeli drag is all about, what it's meant to achieve, why it's there. It kind of binds the community together as a kind of a shared goal, if you like, alongside with close-knit structure. So while not all the drag queens know one another, some of them are friends, some are enemies, some are frenemies, they still all have these kind of ties between them that connect them together and bind them in a certain social structure. They also have organized mechanisms to enforce compliance, including adjudication systems. So if two queens, Anita Drink and Tequila Mockingbird, have this disagreement, they would go to a third queen, usually a more senior queen, to adjudicate, to decide between them, for example, who owns what, or who may use when, or who offended whoever. And they also have the power of punishment. Enforcement is carried out through social mechanisms, so gossip, bad-mouthing, ostracism. One of the stories that I heard that was kind of really touched me was about this baby drag, a newcomer into the field. that disobeyed the norms. She copied from her mentor, from her drag mother. This was frowned upon and she was ostracized from the community. 10 years later, she still has nowhere place where she could perform because nobody speaks to her. So it could be very, very severe, this social enforcement. And finally, they also have infrastructure for interaction and information networks. So they have their WhatsApp groups, they have closed Facebook groups where they share information about everything, where you can get makeup, wigs, props, or for example, who disobeyed the norms or who performed where. They share pictures, gossip. I really tried to get into this WhatsApp group, but it's very, very, it's a high wall to cross. They wouldn't let me in, but it was still interesting to see how they interact in terms of their information networks. And reflecting on the normative question. So I was looking at these findings. I understand, what the norms are pre-transformation. I understand what the norms are post-transformation. I even understand what helps in explaining how this kind of social environment is maintained and allows the queens to govern their creativity without using IP law. But I asked myself as an IP lawyer, why isn't there IP law? Why don't the queens use IP law? So the first explanation I found is doctrinal barriers. While some things can be, for example, trademarked, the name could possibly be used as a trademark registered under Israeli law as a trademark. A lot of the other things that the queens care about cannot be protected by IP law. For example, persona cannot enjoy copyright. It's not an expression, it's more of an idea. So copyright just falls short of allowing entitlements to the things that are important to the queens. So there are doctrinal barriers, but there are also practical reasons. We know IP law is costly. We know that IP law involves a lot of litigation. It's just they don't want to go down that path. They're like, it's going to cost us too much. We have a different mechanism that works well. So practical reasons. But another reason was also the rejection of the law. So part of what's very important for queer creators and queer people in general is resistance and subversion. And they see the law as this kind of formalized mechanism, if you like, that they need to resist, they need to battle, they need to subvert. One of the queens told me, and I'm quoting here, as a queer person, the law rejects me, so I reject the law. And this is basically another one of the reasons why we don't see intellectual property law governing this creative community. And finally, there's something that I call the dynamics of the closet. Now, we're familiar with the metaphor of the closet as something that people use to conceal their sexuality or their gender identity. But actually, the closet constructs the everyday lives of queer people. And every time they encounter anyone, they have to come out of the closet in front of that someone that they encounter. And for several of my interviewees, this was something that was really on their minds. They mentioned that they have a fear of homophobia or rejection by lawyers, by the court. One queen told me, the last thing I need is to come out to this homophobe judge that will automatically hate me and reject my claim. Another queen I interviewed, who happens to be a lawyer, said that she will never go to court because she doesn't want the bar to know she's a drag queen because she thinks that will be frowned upon and she wants to become a judge one day. So this, again, dynamic of the law in the closet is another reason why there's no IP law within the drag subculture. So with this in mind, the norms pre-transformation, post-transformation, how this community maintains its governance without using IP law and why we don't see IP law, I reflected on the question of what does this tell us about the evolution of norms in the drag subculture and maybe even wider in other creative industries. So social norms did not emerge together with drag. Drag in Israel emerged in the early 1990s. In the beginning, it was a few individuals here and there, no resource scarcity, no tragedy of the commons, no collective action problems, so no norms. But as the community started growing, they did come to this place where there were collective action problems. Someone invested a lot of money, a lot of time in creating a certain persona, in practicing certain songs. They didn't want other people to use those materials that they created. So this is when we see the emergence of the norms around I would say, the increased prominence and the size of the community becoming a bit more substantial. How are the norms introduced and how are they enforced? Through gatekeeping mechanisms. So it used to, now it's the case, if you want to become a drag queen, all you need to do is see some tutorials on YouTube, maybe see a few shows, and you're pretty much good to go. But it used to be the case that you needed a mentor. They used to call it drag babies and drag daughters and drag mothers, mentor and mentee. The mentors showed the newbies how to apply makeup, how to do shows, where to find producers, but also what the norms were, what the entitlements are, what the different expectations were, what the do's and what the don'ts were. And this gatekeeping mechanism was an important way to introduce the norms and also maintain the norms. And finally, like I mentioned earlier, the norms were enforced through these social mechanisms of gossip, bad-mouthing, ostracism, and social reward is particularly important for the queens. Being a part of the community is crucial for anyone who wants to make it. Even the most high-ranking queens or those on the kind of, on the outsiders, all are really see it as an important part of their identity, being part of the drag community, so people obey the norms. So why have they changed? This kind of worked really well for 20 years, 2 decades. Why has this changed? Well, the kind of immediate explanation is the new cost-benefit reality, right? Mid-2010s, drag transitions from this losing economy where people lost money performing drag to an economy where we have now in Israel at least 6 queens that their only profession, that's what they do. They're drag queens and that's how they make their living. Another about 10 make substantial money out of it. So this new cost-benefit reality, of course, has reflected in the norms. There are also changes to the motivations of doing drag. While for a lot of people, the initial motivations of doing drag is about expressing their identity, their sexuality, about having fun, about making a political comment, many different motivations. The motivation to continue doing drag year after year after year, some drag queens have been performing since the 1990s, has shifted to be more about economic incentives. So again, this is reflected in the changing norms. There's also change to the social composition and group dynamics in the drag community. So surprisingly, maybe in the 1990s and early 2000s, drag was very homogenous. There was an expectation of how you look. There was a particular methodology of how you perform. But again, in the mid-2010s, because of different reasons, drag has transformed, and also we see drag kings, we see bearded ladies, we see avant-garde drag, we see a lot of different types of drag all of a sudden becoming more influential, and that also changed the social composition of the group. Finally, another interesting observation that kind of came up was what I call international influence or copycat behavior. Drag has become an international phenomenon in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and other countries as well. Israeli drag queens go to perform overseas. Queens from other countries come to perform in Israel. There's more conversation between these different communities. And some of the norms that are practiced overseas have been imported into the Israeli drag community. And therefore, we see norms such as minimum fees, for example, which didn't exist in the past. So here's what I find as an explanation, if you like, of how these norms have evolved over time, why they have evolved over time. And I want to finish quickly with a few of the implications that I think are important to take from this type of study. First, I think that by examining the elements that support successful self-governance within the drag subculture, we can gain valuable insights into other creative subcultures that thrive without relying on IP. And we can ask ourselves, do they share these commonalities, or is there something substantially different between them? For example, are they also close-knit? Do they also manage their resources using these social norm systems or not? Secondly, it also prompts us to rethink some of the existing IP conventions that we have. For example, it emphasizes the constraints of IP in effectively incentivizing all creative industries to create more and to share their creativity. Thirdly, my study, I think, is the first to empirically examine this transition in creative subculture before and after, when it was small and countercultural, after it became big, lucrative, and mainstream culture. And of course, this reflects on many different IP theories about transitioning, about norms governance. It could illuminate other discussions outside of IP, for example, in order without law literature. Again, looking at this self-governing community before and after it transformed. And finally, looking at a queer creative subculture also allows us to better appreciate IP's role in fostering or impeding cultural participation, creative expression for marginalized groups. For instance, one of my findings is the way that drag queens perceive IP law. They see it as oppressive, as something that they need to resist. And every time I told them that they could actually protect some of their rights using IP law, they were shocked. They're like, no way, this cannot happen. But actually it is the case. So it does also bring this kind of question to light as what we as IP lawyers can do to accommodate queer creativity and marginalized subcultures. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.